Welcome to Crime Central South Africa, a product of I Wish You Would Publications, a podcast that takes you deep into the darkest corner of human nature, uncovering the chilling stories that leave us questioning the limits of morality. In this episode, we delve into a case that shook the nation to its core, the brutal and unfathomable murders that took place on a quiet night in January 2015. This is the story of the Van Breda family, a family torn apart not by strangers, but from within. In a secure, affluent estate in Stellenbosch, South Africa, 3 family members were found hacked to death, and one survivor was left clinging to life. The only other person in the house? Their son, Henri van Breda. How could this happen in a family described as close-knit, successful, and happy? What led to this unimaginable act of violence? And could it be that one of their own, Henri, was responsible for this bloodbath? Or as he claims, was it the work of an unknown intruder? Tonight we bring you the horrifying tale of familicide, the psychological breakdown that can drive one to turn on their loved ones. This case raises questions that haunt us all. How well do we truly know the people we share our lives with? And what unspeakable secrets might be lurking behind the facade of a perfect family? Stay with us as we peel back the layers of the tragic and twisted case. But first, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Crime Central South Africa on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio fix. Like, share, comment, and rate every episode so you don't miss out on the darkest stories South Africa has to offer. Now, let's enter the House of Horrors where a family's fate was sealed forever. The term familicide, the murder of one's own family, is among the most shocking and incomprehensible of all crimes. It is a term that suggests an unimaginable fracture within the intimate bonds that hold a family together. When we think of family, we think of safety, love, protection. Yet, for some, the home becomes a theatre of the most grotesque violence. The Van Breda case is one of those nightmares, where the very people meant to love and protect each other met a bloody and brutal end inside their own sanctuary. On January 27th, 2015, the South African public would be shaken by headlines too horrific to fathom. Inside their luxurious home on the secure, affluent estate of De Zalze in Stellenbosch, 3 members of the Van Breda family, Father Martin, Mother Teresa, and older brother Rudy, were found brutally murdered, their bodies savaged by repeated blows from an axe. The only survivors, Henri van Breda, the youngest daughter, left in critical condition, and her brother, Henri van Breda, the middle child, who would later stand trial for the murders. But how did it come to this? What kind of psychological collapse could push a person to commit such an atrocity? To understand the darkness of this case, we must first understand familicide, a crime so rare and yet disturbingly familiar. Familicide is often committed by someone who feels trapped, humiliated, or overwhelmed by their circumstances. These perpetrators are not typically strangers to violence, nor are they motivated by simple greed. Familicide is driven by deep-seated psychological stresses, mental illness, or personal crisis, resulting in the obliteration of those closest to the perpetrator, followed by either suicide or an attempt to shift the blame onto external forces. In this case, the latter. Henri van Breda was just 20 years old when his family's idyllic life was shattered. The Van Breda family was prosperous. His father Martin was a successful businessman, a man of respect and influence, known for his work in the educational field with the EduGrow project. They had immigrated to Australia in 2006, seeking a better life, but had returned to South Africa in 2014 to be closer to family and for Martin to pursue his business ventures. The family had relocated to the exclusive de Zalze estate, a place known for its sprawling vineyards, scenic golf courses, and above all, its security. It was a gated community designed to keep dangers out, with electric fencing, surveillance cameras, and patrols. But what happens when the real danger comes from within? From the outside, the Van Bredas appeared to have it all. Martin was a powerful figure in the business world, a man with a commanding presence. Teresa, his wife, was the heart of the family, caring, devoted, and loved by all. Their eldest son, Rudy, was the pride of the family, excelling academically and athletically, a role model to his younger siblings. Marlee, the youngest, was still in school, a vibrant teenager with her whole life ahead of her. And then there was Henri. He had returned from studying in Australia just months before the murders, dropping out of his university studies for reasons that were never entirely clear. On the surface, he seemed like the typical middle child, but as the investigation would reveal, his role in the family dynamic was far from simple. Familicide, like many crimes of this nature, often occurs in families where high expectations, mental health issues, or financial pressures create an unbearable weight. But the Van Breda family showed no obvious signs of such distress. There were no financial problems, no public signs of tension or conflict. The family was close-knit, according to those who knew them. Friends and relatives described them as a unit with no enemies, no dark secrets, just a loving family living the good life. And yet, on that fateful morning, the Van Breda household was reduced to a slaughterhouse, soaked in blood and chaos, with only Henri emerging unscathed. Henri's version of events was bizarre, to say the least. According to him, a masked intruder, dressed in black and armed with an axe, had entered their home in the early hours of the morning. He claimed to have witnessed the brutal attacks on his brother and father, and that, in a moment of panic, he had fought off the attacker, sustaining superficial injuries in the process. Henri alleged that this mysterious intruder had fled the scene, leaving him to make a disoriented and strangely calm emergency call to the authorities, hours after the murders had taken place. But the story didn't add up. The de Zalze estate was a fortress. Entry and exit were tightly controlled. The electric fence was untouched, and no signs of forced entry were found. Henri, with his curious behavior and contradictory statements, soon found himself the focus of the investigation. And as the details of the case unraveled, the idea of an external assailant became more and more improbable. So what could have driven Henri to kill? Could it be that he had fallen prey to the same psychological triggers seen in other cases of familicide? Was it resentment, a desire for freedom from his father's overbearing expectations, or perhaps an unspoken mental health issue that spiraled into violence? These are the questions that would haunt the trial and the South African public as they've watched the case unfold in the media. What we know is that familicide is rarely a crime of impulse. It is the culmination of psychological cracks that run deep and then, when unchecked, can explode into unimaginable violence. In the case of Henri van Breda, we are left to speculate. Were these cracks forming long before the murders, or was this a sudden, catastrophic breakdown that no one saw coming? Henri was not a stranger to privilege. Raised in a wealthy household, he had access to the best education, lived in one of the most exclusive estates, and yet something dark lingered beneath the surface. His return from Australia, his academic failure, and his awkward integration back into family life all painted a picture of a young man struggling with his place in the world. Perhaps it was this sense of being adrift, disconnected from his family, expectations unmet, that led him to this unspeakable act. The Van Breda case isn't just about the gruesome details of the murder. It is a study in the fragility of family bonds and the deep psychological forces that can turn love into hatred. It's a case that asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about what happens when those closest to us become our greatest enemies. When the murders of the Van Breda family first came to light, the Stellenbosch police faced a case unlike any they had ever encountered. The crime scene was inside the fortified walls of the prestigious de Zalze Winelands estate, a place where residents paid for peace of mind, believing they were insulated from the dangers that lay outside. Yet on the morning of January 27, 2015, that illusion was shattered. The The unthinkable had happened, not because an intruder had broken through the security barriers, but because the threat, it seemed, had come from within. The investigation into the Van Breda murders was immediately complicated by the brutality of the crime. The bodies of Martin, Teresa, and Henri van Breda were found in a grotesque tableau with their skulls crushed by repeated blows from an axe. Blood spatter covered the walls, ceilings, and floors. Teresa and Rudy's bodies lay near the bedroom doorway, while Martin's lifeless form was sprawled on a bed nearby. Marilee, the youngest child, was found barely alive, her head severely injured, but somehow clinging to life. Henri, the sole surviving adult, was found with superficial injuries, mere scratches in comparison to the devastation around him. At first glance, the case seemed as though it could have been a home invasion gone horribly wrong. But as the investigation progressed, the inconsistencies in Henri's account of the events that night began to raise more questions than answers. Henri van Breda claimed that a masked intruder had entered the house in the early morning hours and attacked his family while they slept. He described the figure as wearing dark clothing and a balaclava, laughing as he swung the axe with deadly precision. Henri claimed he had tried to fight off the intruder, sustaining minor wounds in the process, before the attacker fled, leaving him to call emergency services. But his story, while horrific, didn't quite add up. The police, under immense pressure to solve this high-profile case, began to piece together the evidence, and what they found pointed not to an outsider, but to Henri himself. The first and perhaps most glaring issue was the lack of any signs of forced entry. De Zalze estate was known for its tight security, with high electrified fences, surveillance cameras, and security patrols. No alarms had been triggered on the night of the murders. The electric fencing surrounding the estate showed no signs of tampering, and the gates remained locked. Investigators reviewed the CCTV footage from the estate security cameras, looking for any indication of a break-in or a suspicious figure leaving the premises. But there was nothing. No one had entered or exited the estate during the crucial hours in which the murders were committed. The estate security was airtight. It quickly became clear that the Van Breda home had not been breached by an outside assailant. Then there was Henri himself. His injuries, while noticeable, were superficial. Investigators found it strange that he had escaped the attack with only minor cuts, while the rest of his family had been slaughtered in such a vicious manner. How could he, a young man who claimed to have fought off an axe-wielding intruder, emerge with nothing more than a few scratches? Henri's calm demeanor during the emergency call also raised suspicions. In the recording, he spoke slowly and clearly, almost detached from the carnage surrounding him. He told the operator that his family had been attacked with an axe, yet there was no sense of panic in his voice, no urgency. Instead, the call stretched out over a painstaking 25 minutes, during which Henri calmly lit and smoked a cigarette. To the investigators, it felt wrong. How could someone remain so composed after witnessing the brutal murder of the entire family? The timeline of the emergency call was another point of concern. The murders had likely occurred in the early morning hours, but Henri did not call for help until nearly 3 hours later. According to his own account, after the attacker fled, Henri had lost consciousness for an unknown period of time, and when he came to, he had tried to call his girlfriend before finally dialing emergency services. Investigators wondered why he hadn't called for help immediately. Why would he try to contact his girlfriend, who lived far away, instead of seeking medical assistance for his gravely injured family? Why didn't he wake the neighbors or alert the estate security team? The more the police looked into Henri's actions that morning, the more troubling the discrepancies became. His story simply did not match the physical evidence. The emergency services arrived to find the house in chaos, with blood everywhere. The axe, the murder weapon, was found discarded on the staircase, smeared with blood. And yet, despite the overwhelming brutality of the crime, Henri had remained unscathed. His explanation of the events, an unseen intruder, a failed attempt to fight back, a loss of consciousness, seemed increasingly implausible. But the investigators knew they couldn't rely on gut instinct alone. They needed hard evidence, something to definitively link Henri to the murders. They turned to forensic experts to help unravel the mystery, and slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Ballistics and blood spatter analysts examined the scene in minute detail. The patterns of blood in the house told a story, one that didn't quite align with Henri's version of events. The position of the bodies, the bloodstains, and the trajectory of the axe blows suggested that the killer had been methodical, moving from one victim to the next with precision. The blood spatter indicated that the person wielding the axe had been close to the victims, delivering powerful, direct strikes. Forensic analysis showed that the blood on Henri's clothes didn't match his account of struggling with an attacker. Instead, it appeared that the blood had been transferred through contact with the bodies. Moreover, there were inconsistencies in Henri's claims about his injuries. Forensic pathologists concluded that his wounds were self-inflicted, shallow cuts made in a controlled manner. These scratches were inconsistent with the kind of defensive wounds one might expect from a life-or-death struggle with a violent intruder. Henri's attempt to portray himself as a victim in the attack fell apart under scrutiny. And then there was the issue of motive. Why would Henri, a young man with no known history of violence, turn on his family in such a brutal way? As investigators dug deeper into his background, a different picture of Henri began to emerge. He had been struggling in university, dropping out of his studies in Australia and returning home to South Africa. There were whispers of drug use and increasing tension between him and his father, Martin, a successful businessman who had high expectations for his children. Henri had returned to the family home just months before the murders, seemingly directionless, a young man adrift in a life of privilege. The prosecution would later argue that it was this sense of failure, this inability to meet his father's expectations, that drove Henri to commit the murders. They painted a picture of a young man who felt trapped by his family, by the weight of their success, and by the suffocating expectations placed upon him. In this version of events, the murders were not the act of a crazy intruder, but the result of Henri's own simmering resentment and psychological unraveling. As the investigation continued, the evidence against Henri mounted. The forensic analysis, the contradictions in his stories, and the lack of any viable alternative suspect all pointed in one direction. And on June 14, 2016, nearly 18 months after the murders, Henri van Breda was arrested and charged with the murder of his family and the attempted murder of his sister, Marilee. But the arrest was only the beginning. The trial that followed would captivate the nation, as the court sought to unravel the mystery of what really happened inside the Van Breda home on that fateful night. Was Henri guilty of the horrific crime, or had he been the victim of a home invasion gone wrong, as he had claimed all along? The answers would come, but not without a long and arduous legal battle. By the time Henri van Breda's trial began, on April 24, 2017, the South African public was captivated. The privileged young man from one of Stellenbosch's wealthiest families was now on trial for the brutal murders of his parents and brother and the attempted murder of his sister. The courtroom became the stage upon which a tragic and horrifying story would unfold. The prosecution and defense battled not only for justice but for the truth, seeking to piece together the events that took place on that January night. The question on everyone's minds: was Henri truly guilty, or was this a case of an elaborate home invasion gone wrong, as he claimed? Henri pleaded not guilty to all the charges. He maintained that an unknown assailant had entered their home in the early hours of the morning and attacked his family while they slept. His defense team, led by advocate Pieter Botha, aimed to poke holes in the state's case, casting doubt on the evidence and highlighting the lack of direct proof linking Henri to the murders. They argued that the state's case was built on circumstantial evidence and that the absence of a clear motive should weigh in Henri's favor. But the state, represented by advocate Susan Galloway, had a much different narrative, one where the most likely killer was sitting in the dock, not an imaginary intruder. The trial was a slow and methodical process, lasting nearly 70 days, filled with intense cross-examinations, expert testimonies, and a courtroom brimming with emotions. As the trial began, the weight of the evidence against Henri became more apparent. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They would rely on the forensic evidence, Henri's behavior after the murders, and the implausibility of his version of events to prove his guilt. One of the key witnesses for the state was the esteemed ballistics and blood spatter expert, Colonel Chris Mangena. Mangena had carefully reconstructed the crime scene using blood spatter analysis, and his testimony painted a chilling picture of what had occurred inside the Van Breda home. According to Mangena, the blood spatter patterns indicated that the person wielding the axe had been in close proximity to the victims, delivering repeated, powerful blows. The evidence was crucial because it contradicted Henri's claim that he had fought off an intruder. The blood patterns on his clothes, combined with the lack of defensive wounds, suggested that he was not a bystander or victim. He was the perpetrator. Henri's version of events, that he had lost consciousness after the attack and woke up hours later, was also put under scrutiny. Forensic pathologists testified that his injuries were superficial and self-inflicted. These wounds, they argued, were more consistent with someone staging an attack than with someone who had fought for his life. The shallow cuts on Henri's arms and chest, when compared to the devastating injuries inflicted on his family, painted a damning contrast. Another critical moment in the trial came when the court listened to the emergency call Henri made to emergency services at 12 minutes past 7 a.m. on the morning of the murders. For many in the courtroom, this call was one of the most perplexing pieces of evidence. Henri, speaking calmly and without urgency, described the scene of the massacre with a chilling detachment. He spoke of his family's head injuries and mentioned that his sister Marilee was still moving, yet there was no panic in his voice, no desperation. The recording stretched on for a full 25 minutes, during which time Henri seemed more concerned with providing directions to the estate than with the fact that his family lay dead or dying around him. For the prosecution, this call was a critical piece of evidence. It showed, they argued, that Henri was not acting like a traumatized victim of a horrific crime. His demeanor was too calm, too collected for someone who had just witnessed the slaughter of his family. The state contended that this was not the behavior of a man in shock. It was the behavior of a man trying to cover up his guilt. But the defense was not without its own arsenal of arguments. Advocate Botha pushed back hard against the state's case, attempting to undermine the credibility of the forensic evidence and raise doubts about the police investigation. The defense called into question the handling of the crime scene, pointing out possible contamination of evidence and inconsistencies in the police's procedures. They also questioned the reliability of the state's forensic experts, suggesting that their conclusions were speculative rather than definitive. One of the defense's main strategies was to emphasize the possibility of an intruder. They pointed to the lack of a clear motive for Henri to kill his family, arguing that without a compelling reason, it was unreasonable to assume he had committed such a brutal act. They also noted the reports of security weaknesses at the De Zalze estate, suggesting that an intruder could have slipped through the cracks in the estate's defenses. However, the prosecution quickly dismantled this theory, showing that there were no signs of forced entry and no credible evidence that anyone other than Henri had been in the house that night. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Henri's behavior was going to be a significant factor in the case. Not only had he waited nearly 3 hours to call emergency services after the attack, but he had also lit and smoked cigarettes while standing over the bodies of his family members. This chilling detail was highlighted by the prosecution, who argued that it was further proof of Henri's lack of emotional connection to the crime. How, they asked, could a son stand in the aftermath of such carnage and calmly smoke not 1, but 3 cigarettes? The defense, however, argued that Henri's calm demeanor could be explained by his history of epilepsy. They called neurologist Dr. James Butler to the stand, who testified that Henri may have been in a postictal state, a period of confusion that follows an epileptic seizure. Dr. Butler suggested that if Henri had suffered a seizure during or after the attack, it could explain his detached behavior and his delay in calling for help. This testimony, while compelling, was not enough to shake the prosecution's narrative. Dr. Butler admitted under cross-examination that while a postictal state could account for some of Henri's behavior, it did not explain everything. Henri's ability to speak coherently on the emergency call, his efforts to conceal his own role in the attack, and the nature of his injuries all pointed to something much more sinister. Throughout the trial, the media played a central role in shaping public perception. The The courtroom was packed with journalists and onlookers, all eager to see how the case would unfold. Headlines splashed across newspapers and websites, dissecting every new piece of evidence and every twist in the proceedings. For many, Henri had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. But for Judge Siraj Desai, the task was to remain impartial, weighing the evidence carefully before reaching a verdict. After months of testimony and argument, the trial drew to a close. Both the prosecution and defense made their final statements, summing up their cases. The state maintained that Henri van Breda was the only person who could have committed these murders, pointing to the overwhelming forensic evidence and the sheer implausibility of his story. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the state had failed to prove Henri's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the possibility of an intruder could not be ruled out entirely. And then, on May 21st, 2018, after more than a year of trial proceedings, Judge Desai delivered his verdict. The judge found Henri van Breda guilty on all counts: 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. In his judgment, Desai described Henri's version of events as far-fetched and improbable. He rejected the idea that an intruder had entered the home, citing the lack of evidence to support such a claim. The judge also highlighted the brutality of the murders, noting that the force used to kill the victims was consistent with an attack driven by rage or resentment. Henri, once the privileged son of a wealthy family, was now a convicted murderer. But the story did not end there. The defense would appeal the conviction, arguing that the trial had been flawed and that new evidence could exonerate their client. For now, though, Henri van Breda would face the consequences of his actions. Henri, the once privileged son of an affluent family, was now a convicted killer, sentenced to life in prison. The sentence was no less harrowing. Henri van Breda was sentenced to 3 life sentences for the murders of his parents and brother, 1 life term for each life taken. In addition, he was handed 15 years for the attempted murder of his sister Marley, who had miraculously survived the attack but sustained lifelong injuries. Lastly, Henri was sentenced to 12 months for defeating the ends of justice, a punishment for the lies he told and the attempts he made to cover up his crimes. For Henri, now 23 years old, it was a sobering and devastating end. The boy who had grown up in luxury, surrounded by privilege and opportunity, would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. As the court adjourned, the reality of what had happened sank in, not just for Henri, but for everyone who had followed the case so closely. The public, who had once speculated endlessly about his guilt or innocence, now had their answer, but it was an answer that left more questions than it resolved. Why did Henri do it? What could have driven him to commit such an horrific act of violence against the very people who had raised and loved him? To this day, no definitive motive has ever been established. Some have speculated that financial pressure, the weight of his father's expectations, or perhaps a growing resentment towards his family may have played a role. Others suggest that mental health issues, possibly exacerbated by drug use or underlying psychological trauma, could have pushed Henri over the edge. But the truth remains elusive, locked away in Henri's mind, a truth that may never fully come to light. For the Van Breda family, the trial brought some measure of closure, but not without an overwhelming sense of loss. 3 lives were taken in the most brutal of ways, and Marley, though alive, would carry the psychological and emotional scars of that night for the rest of her life. During the trial, Marley had no memory of the events that transpired. Her injuries were so severe that she suffered retrograde amnesia, effectively wiping out her recollection of the attack. She had been a key witness in the trial, but her testimony, or lack thereof, became a symbol of the complexity and tragedy of the case. Even after the conviction, the true extent of Marley's trauma was difficult to comprehend. Her family was gone, her brother convicted of the crime, and her memories of that night forever lost to the fog of injury. Despite the conviction, Henri's defense team did not give up. They immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the court had failed to give enough weight to certain inconsistencies in the state's case and that Henri's epilepsy had not been fully explored as a possible explanation for his behavior. They maintained that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that reasonable doubt remained. But the appeal, like many aspects of the case, was an uphill battle. The conviction stood firm, and Henri's sentence remained unchanged. For the South African public, the case would leave an indelible mark. The Van Breda murders weren't just a tale of violence. They were a reflection of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most privileged and seemingly perfect families. The crime had unfolded behind the walls of one of the country's most exclusive estates, a place designed to shield its residents from the dangers of the outside world. But no amount of security could have protected the Van Bredas from the threat within their own home. As the years passed, the case would continue to be discussed and dissected, a reminder of the fragility of family bonds and the horrifying reality of familicide. The psychological underpinnings of such a crime remain complex and difficult to understand. What drives a person to destroy the very foundation of their life? Their family. In the Van Breda case, we are left with more questions than answers, haunted by the knowledge that the ultimate truth may never be fully known. In the aftermath of the trial, Henri van Breda tried to rebuild her life. She had to come to terms not only with her physical injuries, but also with the emotional burden of knowing that her brother had been convicted of attempting to kill her. It is a burden that few can imagine, let alone endure. Her recovery was slow, and although she eventually returned to school and resumed a semblance of normal life, the shadow of that night remained ever present. Henri, meanwhile, continues to serve his sentence at the Drakenstein Correctional Center in the Western Cape, a far cry from the luxury and privilege he once knew. His life, now defined by confinement, stands as a stark contrast to the one he left behind. The appeal process may continue, but for now, Henri van Breda is a convicted murderer, his life story forever intertwined with the brutal killings of his family. But this story, like so many others, is not just about the violence of the verdict. It is a reminder of the thin line between the ordinary and the unthinkable. The Van Breda case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, family dynamics, and the hidden pressures that can lead to tragedy. And while justice may have been served, the full picture of what happened that night remains elusive, leaving us all to wonder, how well do we really know the people closest to us? This concludes the story of the Van Breda murders, but Crime Central South Africa will continue to explore the darkest, most mysterious and complex cases from across the nation. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio fix. Like, share, comment, and rate every episode to help us keep bringing these stories to life. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest horrors are found not in the outside world, but within the walls of our own homes.